If you're working on a project that doesn't use a front-end framework like React, but you want to use Tailwind CSS, and you're working in a backend that uses something like Go or Python or PHP and so on, you might not want to install Node.js in order to use Tailwind CSS. What we're going to do in this video is explore the standalone CLI for Tailwind CSS. We're going to see how we can use that in our projects, and we don't need to rely on the Node.js ecosystem in any way when we use that. So that's perfect if you have a project that's using normal templates in something like Django or Laravel. You can use the standalone CLI, run commands and set up pipelines yourself, and that's going to do all of that without you having to worry about Node.js. And we'll go over some best practices for patterns and for minification and optimization for production when you use this standalone CLI. Now, before we get started, if you want to support the channel, we have this Ko-fi page here, and that's linked in the description. It would be greatly appreciated if you want to support the channel, and don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. So let's get started. Now, I'm on the Tailwind documentation page here, and I'll leave a link to this below the video. The way Tailwind works is by scanning your HTML and JavaScript files and other templates, and it looks in those files for class names that are part of Tailwind CSS. And then when it finds those in the files that you set up, it generates those styles and it writes them to a static CSS file. Now you can see here that the simplest and fastest way to get up and running with Tailwind CSS is with the CLI tool. But if you look below, you'll see that you install that using npm, and then you generate the Tailwind config file using that command there. But what if you're using a framework on the back end that generates the HTML and you don't want to use Node.js in any way? Well, the CLI is also available as a standalone executable. So we're going to go to this page here, and again, I'll leave a link to that below the video. So Tailwind CSS is written in JavaScript and it's distributed as an npm package. And for that reason, you have to install Node.js and npm in order to use that. So the CLI build, the standalone CLI build, is going to give you that power of Tailwind's CLI as a self-contained executable without the requirement for these tools. So let's get started here. We're going to grab the Tailwind standalone CLI, and we can use the commands here, starting with this curl command, but we do need to adjust this depending on our operating system and the architecture of our machine. So what I'm going to do is go to this page here on the latest releases, and we're going to go down here and we can see the latest releases on different platforms. The one I want to get is this one here on Linux x64. So I'm going to copy that, and let's go back to the terminal. And what we're going to do here is paste in that curl command, and that's going to download the Linux x64 version of the standalone CLI. So let's execute this. And after we've downloaded that, if we run the ls-la command, you can see that we have that here in the local directory. Now at this point, I'm going to open up VS Code. So I'm in the same directory here in VS Code, and I have a Django project open. All of the concepts from this video are going to work with any framework, not just Django. What we need to do if we rerun ls-la is we need to make this Tailwind standalone CLI executable. If we look at the permissions on the left-hand side, we don't have executable permissions on that. So if we go back to the documentation, we can get those by running the chmod command. So I'm going to do that just now. And let's go back to VS Code. So it's chmod, and then it's the executable permission plus X. And we can run that against Tailwind CSS-Linux-x64. And that's going to make that executable, which means if we rerun ls-la, you can see it has the executable flag on the left-hand side. Now the last step that we need to do here, and this is actually optional, but it's probably the best thing to do, is rename this executable to just Tailwind CSS. We can do that on Linux or any Unix system by running the mv command. So let's go back to the terminal, and what we're going to do is we're going to rename this file here using mv, and what we want to rename that as is just Tailwind CSS. So again, if we run ls-la, we now have a Tailwind CSS executable in this directory, and we can test running that out. So I'm going to try that just now. Tailwind CSS, and we're going to get back the man page or the help page for this command for the Tailwind standalone CLI. So that means it's installed and we have it here in this directory that we're running a Django project in, and you can place the executable wherever you want on your system. You can add it to the path and so on. We're just going to store it in the local directory. Now what we can do with that executable is we can run the Tailwind CSS init command, and that's going to generate a Tailwind config file, as you can see on the left hand side, with a very basic configuration for Tailwind. And that step there and the steps we're about to follow are very similar, if not the same, as the steps you would use with the npm package. So after you've installed it, you run the init command, And then what you do next is you configure your template paths. So we're going to reference all of the template files in this tailwind.config.js file. So if we look on the left-hand side, the tailwind.config file has a key called content, and that has this string here in an array. Now what we need to do in the context of a Django project is we need to tell Tailwind CSS where to look for Tailwind classes. And if we're using HTML templates, you're going to find that in your templates directories. And this is going to be the same as in frameworks like, for example, Laravel, which has blade templates. We want to tell Tailwind where to look for potentially Tailwind CSS classes that it's going to add to the final bundle. So what I want to do from the Tailwind config file is I want to look in this project in the core directory and in the templates subdirectory. So let's go to the content block, and we're going to reference the current directory, and then within the core application of the Django project, we have a templates subdirectory. And then I want to find 0 or more subdirectories in the templates folder, and we can do that with these 2 stars. And then finally, we add any star.html file. So basically we want to match any HTML file that exists at this location. And we have 2 at the moment, base.html and index.html. So what Tailwind is going to do is it's going to look in these HTML templates, it's going to scan them and try and find classes from the package. And the ones that it finds are going to be added to that final bundle, as we will see in a second. Now, if you want to know more about the content block, you can go to this page here on configuring source paths. I'll leave a link to that below the video, and you can see you can configure as many of these paths as you want. And you also get some information on the types of glob patterns that you can use in order to match all of the content files in your project without adding tons of configuration. So let's now go back to the installation steps. We've done step 2 now, and we are going to move on to step 3. What we need to do here is add Tailwind directives to a CSS file, and you can see on the right hand side input.css, and we have these Tailwind directives. So I'm going to copy these. And what we're going to do in the Django project is we're going to add a folder in the core application. And that folder is going to be named static. And within there, what I'm going to do is just add a new file called input.css. Once we have that file, we can paste in these Tailwind directives. Now we're going to learn a bit more about these at the end of the video. But for now, we're just going to add this and go back to the documentation. Once we've added that, we can start the Tailwind CLI build process. Now, the way this is done is by running the Tailwind CSS executable, and we're going to pass it an input file, and that's going to be that input.css file that we've just created. And then we're also going to pass an output file here, and that is where the generated CSS is going to be sent. Tailwind is going to add it to that file based on the classes that it finds when it scans everything that you reference here in the content block. And also you can pass a -- watch flag to this, and that will continuously scan the template files for any changes and rebuild the bundle at the end of that process. So let's now just reference this command here. I'm going to copy it, and we can paste it into the terminal, and we're going to change it a little bit. So I'm going to clear this and minimize the sidebar. And if we give ourselves a bit more space here, I'm going to paste this in. Now we need to change the files that we're referencing because it's not in a source directory. So we're going to add the core directory, and it's within the static subdirectory that we have the input.css file. And let's just put the output file, output.css, in the same directory. I'm going to copy that, and let's go over here, and we're going to paste that in here. So this is our command. The input file is input.css, the output file is the output.css, and you can place that wherever you want in your Django project or whatever framework you're using, and that can then be picked up from whatever location you specify. So let's run this command, and because it's an executable, I need to add this syntax at the front, and then you can see it's rebuilding the bundle, and that's done. So what I'm going to do is minimize the terminal now, and we're going to bring back the sidebar. Now this was the input file that contained these directives. We now have this output file that's been generated though. And if we look through that, that contains a lot of the default styling that overrides what you see by default in the browser. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop this build process now that we have the output file. I'm going to run the Django server, and we're going to go to the page. So this is the page that contains the unstyled content that we have here in this index.html file. So we have a container div, and we have a header, a paragraph, and a link. But notice that it's not styled at the moment, it just contains the browser defaults. What we're going to do is we're going to take this output.css file that was generated, and we're going to add that to the head tag of the HTML document. So at the top here, what I'm going to do is in Django, load the static template tag. So load static here, and then we can reference that new static file. I'm going to do that just down below here. And this is within the head element, so we're going to add a link tag to this output.css file. We're going to use the static template tag to reference what's in that static directory. And the name of the file was output.css. And don't forget to close the static template tag. And as well as the href, we're going to add a couple of extra attributes. So the style sheet, and we're going to give it a type of text/CSS. Once we've added that, we can go back to the page and refresh this page. And you can see the default styles from the browser have all been removed. And we now have this very simple and rather ugly looking website. But at this point, the important thing is that we can actually start using Tailwind to start styling this page. And that's because we're referencing a bundle that was generated by Tailwind. And if we run that command that we saw earlier in development with the watch flag, we're going to see that we can update the page and that's going to change dynamically. So let's just for now add a second terminal here. And I'm going to copy that Tailwind CSS command. We're going to start this building process in watch mode. And that means that we can add changes now to the files within the content that's referenced here. And when we add Tailwind classes, Tailwind is going to pick that up when it scans the files, and it's going to add the new classes to the output bundle. So let's see an example of this now. If we go to this index.html page, let's target the h1 element here, and we're going to add some classes from Tailwind CSS. So because this is a header, let's give it a class of text 4XL, and that's going to make the font size larger. Let's also make it bold with the font bold class, and we'll give it a color here, kind of randomly chosen of text grey 800. And finally, let's give it some margin bottom, and that's going to separate it from the 𝗰𝗵𝗽𝗁 below. Now, if we go back to the page here and refresh this page, you can see that those styles have already been applied. Now, we're going to style this up to make it look quite nice throughout the rest of the video. But that's showing that we now have a process that's working. When we add Tailwind classes here, and then we save the file, what's happening is that the Tailwind CLI, the standalone CLI that we have at the bottom, is picking up that we have changed this file, and it's going to rescan the directory, rescan the files, and it's going to pick up these that have been used because these are Tailwind classes, and it's going to add them to the output bundle that we have here. We're referencing that in the head tag. And if we go to output.css here, let's scroll right to the bottom of this. You can now see that the classes that we've added, such as text 4XL and font bold and text grey 800, these are now present in the output bundle. And because we have this process running in watch mode, anytime we make changes to index.html, it's going to rebuild that output bundle. Now, this is one big benefit here of using the CLI over something like the CDN. We only ship the classes that we actually use in the project using this method. So if you add the CDN to the project, it's going to basically download the entire Tailwind CSS package. And that's going to require a lot more data to be transmitted over the network than just using a process like this that detects what classes you're using and only ships them to the user. Let's continue styling this now. And what we're going to do is add some styles to the container div. I'm going to make this a flexbox by adding the flex class. And we're going to give it the direction of column. So it's going to be from top to bottom. So basically each of these child elements is going to stack top to bottom. And we can also add an items center class, and that's going to center them on the cross axis, which is the row axis in this case. We can center on the column axis as well with justify center here, not justify content, it's justify center. And finally, I want to give this a minimum height of the entire screen that we're on. So we can use this min_h_screen class from Tailwind, and we'll give it a background color as well of grey 100. So let's have a look and see what that's done. We save this and it's going to rebuild the output bundle, as you can see below. And then if we go back to the page, we can see that this has changed somewhat. We now have a slightly nicer looking layout here. So this entire div that we have here is taking up the full height of the screen, and we're using min_h_screen to do that. And we now have all of the content in a flexbox, and it's top to bottom and it's centered on the page. Now I want to style the paragraph that we have here, and this is the one that's using this lorem ipsum text. So let's go back to the page here, and we're going to add some classes to this paragraph. Let's give it a text grey 600 class. And again, we want some margin bottom to separate it from the anchor tag below. And I'm going to give this quite a lot of padding. So let's say padding x24. So padding on the x-axis to the left and to the right of the text content. And finally, let's center the content with the text center class. If we save this and go back to the page, you can see how that's looking. Not too bad. It could be better, but that'll do for this video. I'm not sure if we need text center actually, so could we remove that? Let's see. If we save that and go back here, I think it's maybe better like this. And actually, on second thought, I'm just going to bring back text center. I think it looks a bit better like this. And finally, we can style the link that we have at the bottom. So using Tailwind CSS, we're going to target this anchor tag and give it some classes. So we want the link to be blue, so I'm going to give it a class of text blue 600. And when we hover over the link, we're going to darken it slightly, so text blue 800. And also on hover, I want to underline the link, so we're going to add the underline class on hover as well. Let's save this and go back to the page. And this time you can see the link is looking a bit better. And this isn't a bad landing page. Maybe if you added some images and stuff, I don't know what you would do here, but this is just a demo. And what you'll notice is that the output bundle will contain all of the classes that we reference here, but it's not going to use all of the other classes that are built into Tailwind. Now at this stage, we've built a decent looking landing page. It's nothing special, but what I'm going to do now is look at some pattern recommendations in Tailwind CSS. And we've already followed some of these rules, but I'm going to paste this in here and search for it. And I'll leave a link to this below the video. Now for best performance and also to avoid false positives, it's important to be as specific as possible with content configuration. So if we look at the content block here, something very broad like this that references any number of subdirectories within the current directory, that's not good. Imagine, for example, you had a node modules directory in there. That's going to scan every single node package. And if you know anything about the JavaScript ecosystem, you'll know that that is often a crazy number of packages. So for performance reasons, you certainly don't want to do that. What is good to do is to be specific with content patterns. So basically reference the directories that you have and that you know contain HTML and JavaScript content that you want to scan. And then when you're in those directories, you can use these glob patterns, but it's important not to just scan everything within a directory if that directory contains different files and potentially external dependencies and so on. Now I want to move on, and I'm going to go back to the documentation here. And let's go to the top where we have the page on the standalone executable. If we scroll down here, we have a section on how this works. And I'm going to very briefly cover this, and then we're going to move on to how we use plugins in Tailwind with the standalone CLI. Now how this works is that we use, or Tailwind uses, a package that's called package. And that's a project by 𝗰𝗽𝗳𝗲𝗲𝗲 that lets you turn a Node.js project into an executable that can be run without installing Node.js. So it bundles all of the parts that your project needs into the executable itself, and it's using this package called package in order to do that. So that's how the Tailwind standalone CLI works. Let's now look at how to use this with plugins that are native to Tailwind. And by native, I mean first-party plugins such as the Forms plugin and the Typography plugin. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add these here. So Tailwind has bundled the latest versions of these first-party plugins, and that comes with the standalone CLI. So in order to use them, we just require them into the Tailwind config file, just as you would in a Node.js project. So I'm going to copy this typography line here. We're only going to use that one. And let's go back to tailwind.config.css, and we're going to paste that in here. So basically, we're requiring the typography plugin, and that contains some prose classes. We're going to add these in index.html. So this paragraph tag that we have here, what I'm going to do is add a class to the end of that called prose small. And if we save this and go back to our application, let's have a look at the paragraph text that we see here. When we refresh this, you can see the style of that has changed, and it's now using the prose small class from the typography plugin. So if you have these first-party plugin requirements in your project, such as typography and forms, you can actually use these with the standalone CLI without requiring NPM. Now I think if you're using something like 𝗰𝗵𝗽𝗁 or 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁, you might actually need to install Node.js in order to use those. Possibly not though, I'm not sure, it's not something I've tried to do. If you are aware of any patterns with the standalone CLI and third-party plugins like 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗁, let us know in the comments. We have a couple of sections left. I want to now look at building for production. So if we look at output.css, it now contains all of the classes that we need based on what we've added to our project. And remember, just to hammer this home, these classes are generated from the files that we add to the content block of the Tailwind config file. Now for building for production, we don't want to have all of this space and comments in the final file because we want to make the final bundle as small as possible so that it can be transmitted over the network as efficiently as possible. Basically, the smaller the file size, the better in this case. Now, if we go to the browser here, and I'm going to open up the DevTools, what I'm going to do is go to the Network tab, and I'm going to do a hard refresh here. And we're going to look at this output.css here. You can see the size of that is 18.9 kilobytes. Now what we want to do is we want to run the 𝗰𝗽𝗽𝗲 flag when we generate the build, and we're going to see how that reduces the file size that's transmitted over the network. So I'm going to leave this page open. We're going to go back to VS Code, and I'm going to stop the Tailwind process here, and we're going to rerun this command. I'm going to minimize the sidebar here, but we're going to change the flag at the right hand side. So let's go to the right hand side here. Instead of the watch flag, we're going to pass the 𝗰𝗽𝗽𝗲 flag here, and that's going to build for production. So let's execute this command, and you can see it's building, but you can see now the output.css file has changed. If we look here, you can see it's removed all of the white space, and it's basically optimizing the build for production. Now let's get back to the browser, and we're going to refresh this, and we're going to look at this output.css file that's been generated here. Remember, that was basically 19 kilobytes before. When we refresh this page, you can see the size of the bundle has been reduced to 12 kilobytes. And these kind of reductions and optimizations are important if you want the best user experience possible, because it means that the web page can load much more quickly. And that's because the server doesn't need to transmit as much data over the wire to the client. So with the Tailwind Standalone CLI and the CLI itself, you can run this --𝗰𝗽𝗽 flag if you want to build for production, and then you can serve that 𝗰𝗽𝗽𝗃 file from your backend server. And that's going to be more efficient than if you don't run that minification or optimization process. So we're coming to the end of the video, but what I want to cover in this part of the video, the last part, is these directives here and the use of CSS layers. Now I'm going to open up the Tailwind documentation on using CSS and layers. So when you need to add truly custom CSS rules to a Tailwind project, the easiest approach is to add the custom CSS to your style sheet. But for more power, you can use the layer directive in CSS to add styles to Tailwind's base, components, and utilities layers. So basically, Tailwind provides the three of these. These are layers that you have in CSS. And that's exactly what you see here in this input.css file. We have a base layer, a components layer, and utilities. Now the question you might be asking is, what are these and why does Tailwind group styles into layers? So in CSS, the order of the rules in your style sheet decides which declaration wins when two selectors have the same specificity. So here's an example. We have a class of button that specifies a background color of blue. And then below that, we have a class of background black that changes that background color to black. Now, if you go below here, we have two buttons. Each of those has the two classes from above, but the color of both of the buttons is going to be black. And that's because that rule comes last in the CSS file. So the order matters here. Whatever rule is last is going to be the declaration that wins if the rules have the same specificity. Now, if you scroll down again here, Tailwind manages this by organizing the styles it generates into three different layers. And that's a concept that's been popularized by this, the scalable and maintainable CSS architecture. I'll leave a link to that below the video as well. Now, the three layers, we have a base layer to begin with, and that's for things like reset rules or default styles that are applied to plain HTML elements. So that's the base layer. And then we have the components layer in Tailwind, and that's for class-based styles that you want to be able to override with utilities. And finally, we have a utilities layer, and that's for small single-purpose classes that should always take precedence over any other styles. So the idea is that your utilities layer has the highest precedence. So if you have two styles with the same specificity in the components layer and the utilities layer, the one in the utilities layer is going to win out. And that makes sense if you think of this conceptually. Utilities should be able to override larger component styles, and that's for customization of those components. So the utilities layer is the one that's got the highest precedence. The components layer is in the middle, and the base layer is just for reset rules and default styles. So when you install Tailwind CSS and you see that to begin with, it's removed all of the default styles that are provided by the browser, that stuff is coming from the base layer. So being explicit about this makes it easier to understand how your styles will interact with each other, and using the layer directive lets you control the final declaration order while still organizing your actual code in whatever way you like. And finally, the layer directive, it helps you control declaration order by automatically relocating your styles to the corresponding Tailwind directive. And it also enables features like modifiers, such as the hover modifier, and tree shaking for your own custom CSS. And tree shaking refers to removing unused CSS from your final bundles. Now there's a lot we can talk about when it comes to Tailwind layers and adding your own styles and also CSS layers in general, but I'm going to leave it there for this video. I hope this video has helped you understand the Tailwind CLI and how we can use it as a standalone executable without having to have Node.js installed. And if this video has been helpful, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want more of this content. And if you want to support the channel, we have that Ko-fi page here as noted in the beginning. Any donations here will be greatly appreciated. Thanks again for watching guys, and we'll see you in the next video.